The year was 2847, and humanity had changed in ways that most alien species could never understand. For the humans who once waged terrible wars against each other had become something entirely different in the eyes of the galaxy. And every species from the core worlds to the outer rim believed that Earth's children were soft creatures who preferred art and music over conflict. Diplomats who smiled and negotiated rather than fought. Healers who rushed to disaster zones across 100 worlds to save lives regardless of species or politics. New Haven was a perfect example of what the galaxy believed humanity had become. A quiet agricultural colony on the edge of coalition space where 200,000 humans lived. Peaceful lives among golden wheat fields and orchards that stretched toward distant mountains. And the colony had no military installations. No weapons factories, no orbital defense platforms. Nothing that suggested these humans were anything other than farmers and craftspeople who wanted nothing more than to raise their families in peace. Commander Daniel Porter stood on the bridge of his freight hauler and watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. His weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as he prepared for another routine cargo run to the neighboring system. And at 52 years old, he had convinced himself that his fighting days were far behind him. That the nightmares that still woke him some nights were just echoes of a past that no longer mattered. He had served in conflicts that the coalition had erased from public records. Battles fought in the darkness between stars, where humanity had shown a face that would have terrified every species in the galaxy. But those wars were classified and forgotten, and the veterans who survived them had scattered across human space to find whatever peace they could salvage from memories that refused to fade. Maria Vance was one of those veterans, a woman of 48 who ran a small support center for others like herself in the colony's main settlement. And she spent her days helping former soldiers adjust to civilian life, teaching them how to sleep without weapons under their pillows, how to walk through crowds without scanning for threats, how to remember that the war was over even when their minds refused to believe it. She had been special operations, the kind of soldier who moved through darkness like a ghost and left no survivors to report what had happened. And now she taught pottery classes to children and organized community events, hiding the killer inside her behind warm smiles and gentle words that came easier with each passing year. Carl Henderson worked a farm on the outskirts of the colony, a man of 61 who had lost his wife and daughter in the Kepler Station massacre 20 years ago. And he had spent every day since trying to find reasons to keep living, planting seeds and watching them grow, because creating life felt like the only way to balance the scales against all the death he had caused and witnessed. He rarely spoke to his neighbors and never attended social gatherings, preferring the company of his crops and the silence of his fields. But everyone in the colony knew him and respected his privacy, understanding without being told that some wounds never fully healed. Dr. Linda Morris ran the colony hospital with the efficiency of someone who had spent years operating in combat zones where supplies were scarce, and every second meant the difference between life and death. And she had saved more lives than she could count on battlefields that officially never existed. Her hands steady even when explosions shook the ground and screams filled the air. These four veterans and thousands more like them had chosen New Haven because it was quiet and far from anything that might remind them of what they had been, what they had done, what they had survived. And for years, their plan had worked perfectly as they built new lives among people who had no idea that their friendly neighbors were some of the most dangerous humans ever. Trained for combat, the Vraxian Dominion had never encountered human military resistance because they had only expanded into regions where humanity maintained its peaceful diplomatic presence. And their scouts spent weeks observing New Haven from hidden positions in the asteroid belt. recording everything they saw and growing more confident with each passing day. War Commander Thesik reviewed the intelligence reports with growing excitement, for the humans on this world showed no signs of military capability whatsoever. Just farmers tending their fields and merchants, selling their goods and families, raising their children without any apparent awareness that predators were watching from the shadows. The Vraxians were a warrior species who had conquered 17 worlds through brutal efficiency, taking what they wanted and enslaving those who survived their initial assaults. And they had long wondered why humanity had been allowed to spread across so many systems when they seemed so obviously weak and vulnerable. New Haven would be their first human conquest, a test case that would prove humans could be dominated just like every other soft species the Vraxians had encountered. And the War Council authorized a full invasion force of 30 warships, carrying 50,000 ground troops, equipped with the finest weapons their empire could produce. Daniel Porter noticed unusual sensor readings on his freight hauler's instruments 3 days before the invasion. Strange energy signatures that flickered at the edge of detection before vanishing. But he dismissed them as asteroid interference and continued his preparations for departure, never suspecting that his quiet retirement was about to end in fire and blood. The Vraxian fleet emerged from hyperspace on a morning that had begun like any other, their massive warships casting shadows across the colony as they took positions in orbit. And every human on New Haven felt their hearts freeze as the alien vessels filled their skies with the promise of destruction. The broadcast came minutes later, transmitted on all frequencies in a harsh language that the universal translators converted to words that left no room for misunderstanding, demanding immediate and unconditional surrender from the human population, promising death to any who resisted and slavery to those who submitted. Colony Governor Patricia Walsh attempted to respond with diplomatic protocols, her voice calm and professional as she requested negotiations and offered peaceful solutions to whatever grievances the Vraxians might have, believing that reason and compromise could resolve any conflict, just as humanity had always taught the Vraxians, answered by destroying a civilian transport that was attempting to flee, vaporizing 300 innocent people in an instant to demonstrate that they had no interest in negotiation, only in conquest. And as the debris scattered across the upper atmosphere like falling stars, something changed in the hearts of 4,000 veterans who had spent years pretending to be ordinary civilians. Daniel Porter felt the old coldness settle into his bones as he watched the transport die. And for the first time in 15 years, he reached for the secure communication device he had hidden in his cabin, the one that connected him to others who had served in the shadows. And his message was simple: they have made a terrible mistake. The message spread through channels that have been silent for years, encrypted frequencies and coded phrases that veterans had memorized during their service and never forgotten. And within 6 hours, every former soldier on New Haven knew that the time for pretending was over. Daniel Porter met Maria Vance in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, their eyes meeting with the recognition of warriors who had seen the same darkness and survived the same horrors. And they wasted no time on pleasantries, because both understood that every minute spent talking was a minute not spent preparing for what was coming. Maria had already contacted her network of special operations veterans, men and women who had performed missions so classified that even their families never knew what they had done. And these ghosts were emerging from their peaceful lives with skills that had never dulled despite years of pretending otherwise. Carl Henderson arrived at the warehouse carrying a bag of equipment he had kept buried beneath his farmhouse, weapons and gear that he had told himself he would never need again. And his weathered face showed no emotion as he laid out the tools of his former trade on a table and began checking each item with practiced efficiency. Dr. Linda Morris established a medical station In the old mining tunnels beneath the colony, spaces that most civilians had forgotten existed, but that veterans had quietly mapped and memorized years ago. And she organized supplies and trained volunteers while preparing for casualties that she hoped would never come, but knew were inevitable. The Vraxians landed their ground forces, expecting to find terrified civilians cowering in their homes and begging for mercy. But instead they found empty streets and abandoned buildings. Every human somehow vanished in the hours between the invasion announcement and the troop deployment war commander. Thesic stood in the colony's central plaza and felt confusion replacing his earlier confidence. For his intelligence had reported no evacuation capabilities and no underground shelters. Yet 200,000 humans had simply disappeared, as if the ground had swallowed them whole. He ordered his troops to search every building and scan every field, promising rewards for whoever found where the humans were hiding. And his soldiers spread across the colony with weapons ready, expecting resistance that never came and growing more nervous with each empty home. They cleared Daniel Porter, watched the enemy patrols from a concealed position on a rooftop, counting their numbers and noting their equipment while his mind automatically calculated firing angles and escape routes. Skills that came back to him as easily as breathing, despite all the years he had spent trying to forget them. Maria Vance organized the veterans into independent cells of 10 to 15 fighters each, groups small enough to operate without detection, but large enough to cause serious damage. And she established communication protocols using methods that the Vraxians would never recognize as military coordination. The aliens relied on advanced technology for their communications, while the humans used old-fashioned techniques developed in wars fought before most species had achieved spaceflight. Hand signals and coded messages and runners who moved through the tunnels carrying orders that could never be intercepted or traced. Carl Henderson spent the first night of the occupation observing enemy patrol patterns with the patience of a man who had once waited in concealment for 72 hours to take a single shot. And he recorded every detail in the mental framework he had developed during decades of service, building a picture of enemy operations that would prove invaluable in the days ahead. The Vraxian soldiers grew frustrated when their searches produced nothing, and some began destroying property out of anger, burning farms and smashing equipment in attempts to draw the humans out of hiding through destruction of everything they had built. War Commander Thesic approved these tactics, believing that humans were emotional creatures who would surrender rather than watch their possessions be destroyed. But he did not understand that many of the veterans on New Haven had already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to protect except each other. Maria assembled the cell leaders in the deepest part of the tunnel network, veterans whose combined experience covered every type of warfare humanity had ever waged. And she laid out the strategic situation with the cold precision of someone planning a military campaign. Rather than a desperate resistance, they had 4,000 trained soldiers against 50,000 enemy troops, odds that would have seemed hopeless to anyone who did not understand what those 4,000 had survived and what they were capable of doing when protecting their homes and families. Daniel spoke to the assembled veterans with quiet authority, explaining that their goal was not to win through force of arms, but to make the occupation so costly that the Vraxians would choose to withdraw rather than continue bleeding soldiers into an invisible enemy. Carl provided detailed intelligence on enemy positions and patrol routes, his observations forming the foundation of a plan that would unfold over the coming days like a trap slowly closing around prey that did not realize it was already caught. Dr. Linda listened to the planning session while organizing her medical supplies, knowing that the carefully maintained piece of New Haven was about to shatter and that her skills would soon be needed more than at any time since she had left active service. The veterans divided into their cells and prepared to move out through the tunnel network, emerging at predetermined positions across the colony where they would begin the work of teaching the Vraxians exactly how wrong their intelligence had been. Daniel Porter looked at the faces around him, men and women who had buried their warrior selves beneath years of peaceful living, and he saw that same cold readiness returning to their eyes as they remembered who they truly were. Maria Vance checked her weapons one final time before leading her cell toward their assigned position, and as she moved through the darkness, she allowed herself to feel something she had suppressed for years: the satisfaction of being exactly what she was trained to be. Carl Henderson followed his assigned route toward the enemy command post, moving through shadows with the silence of a predator who had perfected the art of invisibility through countless operations that had left no witnesses and no records. The first night of true resistance would begin in 3 hours, and by morning, the Vraxians would discover that the peaceful farmers they had expected to conquer were actually wolves who had chosen to wear the clothing of sheep. Veterans of humanity's darkest wars who had simply been waiting for a reason to remember what they were. Daniel addressed the gathered veterans one final time before they dispersed to their positions, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of combat leadership. They believe we are farmers and shopkeepers who will surrender at the first sign of real violence. But they have made the worst mistake any predator can make. And tonight we will show them exactly what happens when you threaten the families and homes of soldiers who chose peace only because they understood better than anyone the alternative. The veterans moved out in silence, ghosts dispersing into the night. And somewhere in the colony's central plaza, War Commander Desic reviewed his progress reports with satisfaction, completely unaware that he had just become prey in a hunt that would haunt Vraxian nightmares for generations to come. The first patrol vanished at midnight without a single shot fired or alarm raised. 8 Vraxian soldiers who walked into a narrow alley and simply never emerged. And when their relief arrived 2 hours later, they found only empty armor and weapons arranged in a neat row as if the occupants had simply evaporated into the night air. War Commander Desic received the report with disbelief because his soldiers did not simply disappear. They were elite warriors from the Dominion's finest units, trained in combat against a dozen different species and equipped with technology that should have detected any threat before it could get close enough to matter. He ordered increased patrol sizes and mandatory check-ins every 15 minutes, believing that numbers and vigilance would prevent whatever had taken his soldiers from striking again. But by morning, 3 more patrols had vanished, and the survivors were reporting shadows that moved wrong and sounds that came from everywhere and nowhere. Daniel Porter coordinated the attacks through the tunnel network, receiving reports from each cell and adjusting tactics based on enemy responses. And he felt the old familiar rhythm of command returning as his mind tracked dozens of simultaneous operations across the colony. Maria Vance led her cell through a drainage system that the Vraxians had never mapped, emerging behind enemy lines to strike at a supply convoy carrying ammunition and equipment to the forward positions. And her team disabled 8 vehicles and captured enough weapons to arm another 50 fighters before disappearing back into the darkness. Carl Henderson performed the most difficult mission of the first night, infiltrating the perimeter around the Vraxian command post and capturing a junior officer alive, dragging the terrified alien through passages no larger than ventilation ducts until he reached the interrogation team waiting in the tunnels. The captured officer proved surprisingly cooperative. Once he understood that the humans were not the primitive farmers his briefings had described, and he provided detailed information about fleet positions, command frequencies, and the location of War Commander Desic's personal quarters. Dr. Linda Morris treated the wounded from the night's operations with the same skill she had displayed in combat hospitals decades ago. Her hands steady and her mind focused as she saved lives that would have been lost without her expertise. And she refused to let a single veteran die from wounds the proper care could heal. The second night was worse for the Vraxians as the humans grew bolder and more coordinated, striking at multiple positions simultaneously in attacks that lasted only seconds before the attackers vanished like smoke and wind, leaving behind destroyed equipment and casualties that the occupation force could not afford to sustain. Thesic demanded explanations from his intelligence officers who had promised an easy conquest, screaming at them in front of his entire staff while his soldiers died in the darkness outside his headquarters. And his rage provided no answers because nobody could explain how farmers had become an invisible army overnight. Fuel depot explosion on the third night was Maria Vance's masterwork. A perfectly coordinated assault that breached security, planted charges, and evacuated before detonation, destroying enough fuel to strand every Vraxian ground vehicle on the colony and force the fleet to divert resources to emergency resupply. Daniel watched the flames from a distance and allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction before returning to his command post in the tunnels, knowing that every victory brought them closer to the moment when Thesic would realize he could not win on the ground and would turn to orbital bombardment instead. Carl Henderson continued his surveillance operations despite the increased enemy activity, moving through positions that should have been impossible to reach and gathering intelligence that gave the veterans advance warning of every Vraxian countermeasure before it could be implemented. Vraxian soldiers began refusing patrol assignments, their morale shattered by nights of attacks from enemies they could not see or fight. And even the harshest disciplinary measures could not restore their willingness to walk into darkness, where death waited in every Shadow War commander. Thesic faced a choice he had never imagined making: withdraw his ground forces and admit defeat, or escalate to orbital bombardment and destroy the colony entirely. And his pride refused to accept retreat, while his pragmatism recognized that his invasion had become a disaster. He contacted the fleet commander and requested authorization for limited orbital strikes against suspected resistance positions, arguing that terror from above would break the human spirit where ground operations had failed. And the fleet commander agreed because the Vraxians had never lost a ground campaign and could not afford to start now. Daniel intercepted the communication through equipment captured from the junior officer, and his blood ran cold as he realized that everything they had achieved would mean nothing if the enemy simply burned the colony from orbit, killing civilians and fighters alike in fire that no amount of skill or courage could survive. He gathered the cell leaders for an emergency council in the deepest part of the tunnel network, presenting the intelligence with the calm professionalism that veterans expected from their commanders, even when the news was catastrophic. And he asked for options that might give them a chance to survive what was coming. Maria Vance proposed the only solution that made tactical sense: an assault on the fleet itself using captured Vraxian equipment and codes. A mission so dangerous that everyone who volunteered would likely die, but that might give the civilians enough time to evacuate to positions beyond the bombardment zone. Carl Henderson volunteered immediately, his eyes showing the peace of a man who had finally found a purpose worthy of the skills he had spent years trying to forget. And within minutes, every cell leader had added their names to the list, despite knowing what the mission would cost. Dr. Linda Morris organized the civilian evacuation, moving 200,000 people through tunnels and hidden routes to shelters in the mountains that the Vraxians had never discovered. And she worked without sleep, because every hour she bought was another hour for families to reach safety. Daniel Porter reviewed the captured Vraxian landing craft in the underground hangar, where they had hidden it after the supply convoy raid. running his hands over controls that were alien, but not incomprehensible. And he began planning an assault that would either save New Haven or ensure that humanity's enemies would never again underestimate the peaceful farmers who had chosen to fight. The veterans spent their final night on solid ground, preparing for a battle that would be fought among the stars. And somewhere above them, the Vraxian fleet waited in orbit, completely unaware that the prey they had come to conquer was about to become the deadliest threat they had ever faced. The captured landing craft rose through the atmosphere on a trajectory that would have alarmed any competent sensor operator. But the codes they transmitted identified them as a returning patrol vessel and the exhausted Vraxian fleet crews waved them through without detailed inspection. Daniel Porter sat at the controls with Maria Vance beside him, both wearing stolen Vraxian armor over their human bodies, their hearts pounding with adrenaline as the massive flagship grew larger in their viewport with each passing second. Behind them crouched 12 veterans who had volunteered for what everyone understood was likely a one-way mission. Men and women who had survived the worst wars humanity had ever fought and who now faced their final battle with the calm acceptance of soldiers who had long ago made peace with death. The ground assault began the moment the landing craft cleared the atmosphere. 3,000 veterans emerging from hiding to attack Vraxian positions across the colony in a coordinated offensive designed to draw attention away from the desperate gamble unfolding in orbit. Carl Henderson led the assault on the communications hub, fighting through enemy positions with the precision and efficiency of a man who had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of combat. And his team reached their objective despite resistance that would have stopped any normal attacking force war commander. Desic watched his defensive lines collapse on the tactical display and realized with growing horror that the handful of attacks he had endured over the past days had been nothing more than preparation for this moment. Probing assaults designed to identify weaknesses that were now being exploited with devastating effectiveness. Maria Vance coordinated with Daniel from the landing craft, timing the ground assault to reach its climax just as they approached the flagship, ensuring that the fleet commander would be distracted by the chaos below when the real threat arrived at his doorstep. The landing craft docked at the flagship's secondary bay, a location chosen because intelligence indicated it was used for supply transfers and therefore less heavily guarded than the primary hangar. And the veterans emerged in Vraxian armor that fooled the first guards they encountered. Daniel killed the first enemy soldier with a blade rather than a weapon because the sound of gunfire would have alerted the entire ship. And his team moved through corridors designed for larger bodies with the fluid grace of predators who had trained for exactly this kind of close quarters combat. Carl Henderson reached the communications hub at the precise moment his demolition charges were primed, and he transmitted a final message to Daniel, confirming that the ground assault had achieved its objectives before pressing the detonation switch and disappearing in a flash of light that severed all communication between the Vraxian ground forces and their fleet. The explosion rocked the colony and war commander Desic felt his connection to the flagship go dark, leaving him isolated and blind while his soldiers died around him and enemies emerged from shadows that should have been empty. Maria Vance broke from Daniel's team to hunt Desic personally, fighting through his bodyguards with skills that no farmer should have possessed. And she found him cowering in his command bunker with terror in his eyes as he finally understood how completely his invasion had failed. Daniel reached the flagship bridge after fighting through 24 Vraxian soldiers, his team reduced to 5 survivors, but still combat effective as they breached the final door and confronted the fleet commander surrounded by his bridge crew. Fleet commander was an older Vraxian whose scars spoke of countless victories, and he faced the human invaders with more composure than his subordinates. demanding to know how simple colonists had accomplished what trained military forces had failed to achieve against his ships. Daniel removed his helmet so the Vraxian could see his face. The face of a human who looked nothing like the soft diplomat the galaxy believed all humans to be. And his eyes held the cold calculation of a warrior who had killed more enemies than he could remember, answered the fleet commander's question with words that would be repeated across the galaxy for centuries. We were never farmers who became soldiers to save ourselves. We were soldiers who became farmers because we chose peace. And you made the mistake of confusing our choice for weakness. The bridge crew attacked, and Daniel's team responded with the lethal efficiency of veterans who had fought in the darkest wars humanity had ever waged. And within 60 seconds, every Vraxian on the bridge was dead, except the fleet commander who knelt before Daniel with a blade at his throat. Maria Vance dragged War Commander Vesic from his bunker and forced him to survey the destruction of his invasion force. His elite soldiers scattered and broken by an enemy they had dismissed as helpless. And she offered him a choice: order his remaining ground forces to surrender or watch them die one by one. Dr. Linda Morris led the final evacuation column through tunnels that Vraxian soldiers had breached, organizing a fighting retreat that kept civilians moving toward safety while veterans held the line against enemies who were finally learning to fear the humans they had come to enslave. Daniel activated the flagship's self-destruct sequence using codes extracted from the captured officer, setting a countdown that would give the remaining Vraxian ships exactly 90 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether they lived or died. He broadcast on all frequencies, his voice carrying across the void to every ship in the invasion fleet. Your flagship will detonate in 90 seconds, and your ground forces have been destroyed. You have one chance to retreat and carry a message back to your dominion. Or you can stay and share the fate of your commanders. The surviving veterans on the flagship gathered around Daniel as the countdown continued, knowing they had no means of escape, but accepting their fate with the peace of soldiers who had finally found a battle worthy of their sacrifice. Maria Vance stood over the defeated war commander and waited for the response from the fleet, a blade still ready, because she had learned long ago that enemies were never truly defeated until they acknowledged their loss. The seconds ticked away as the galaxy held its breath, and Daniel Porter watched the remaining Vraxian ships through the viewport, wondering if his desperate gamble had bought his people freedom or simply delayed their destruction. The Vraxian fleet broke formation and fled toward hyperspace with 43 seconds remaining on the countdown, their ships scattering like prey animals who had finally recognized the predator among them. And Daniel Porter watched them go with exhaustion, replacing the adrenaline that had sustained him through the assault. Maria Vance disarmed the self-destruct sequence using the same codes that had activated it, her hands steady despite the impossible tension of the past hour. And she looked at Daniel with something approaching wonder, because they had actually survived a mission that should have killed them all. The veterans on the bridge embraced each other with the raw emotion of soldiers who had faced death together and emerged victorious, tears streaming down faces hardened by years of combat as they realized that New Haven was safe and their families would live to see another sunrise. War Commander Vesic knelt in the ruins of his command bunker as Maria Vance's blade pressed against his neck, his eyes showing the broken spirit of a conqueror who had become the conquered. And he waited for the death that military tradition demanded for commanders who failed so completely. Maria studied her defeated enemy for a long moment before lowering her weapon and stepping back, offering surrender terms that the Vraxian could barely comprehend, because no species the Dominion had ever conquered had shown mercy to their captors. She spoke words that would define humanity's reputation for generations. We do not kill those who have surrendered because we understand something your empire never learned: that true strength is measured not by the enemies you destroy, but but by the mercy you choose to show when destruction would be easier. The surviving Vraxian ground forces laid down their weapons when they learned their commanders had been defeated. 50,000 soldiers who had expected to enslave a peaceful colony instead becoming prisoners of farmers who treated them with dignity. Their own empire would never have shown Dr. Linda Morris emerged from the tunnels to find a colony battered but free, and she immediately organized medical care for wounded veterans and prisoners alike because her oath to heal applied to all beings, regardless of which side they had fought on. Daniel Porter brought the captured flagship into a stable orbit and transmitted a message to Coalition space, informing the governing council that New Haven had repelled an unprovoked invasion and requesting diplomatic assistance to manage the aftermath of a conflict that should never have happened. Coalition forces arrived 3 days later to find a sight that no one in the galaxy had ever expected: a human agricultural colony that had defeated a full-scale military invasion using veterans who had spent years pretending to be nothing more than farmers and shopkeepers. The Coalition investigators interviewed survivors from both sides, piecing together a story that seemed impossible until the evidence became undeniable, and their reports spread through diplomatic channels like wildfire as species across the galaxy realized that humanity had been hiding something extraordinary. Daniel stood before the Coalition representatives and answered their questions with the honesty of a man who no longer had anything to hide, explaining how humanity's peaceful diplomatic presence was a choice rather than a limitation, how the veterans of classified wars had scattered across human space seeking peace, but never forgetting their training. Maria Vance returned to her support center and found it filled with veterans who needed her help more than ever. Men and women processing the trauma of returning to combat after years of healing. And she understood that her work was far from finished, even though the battle had been won. The memorial service for the fallen was held on a hill overlooking the fields that Carl Henderson had spent his final years cultivating. And Daniel spoke about his friend with words that honored the sacrifice of a man who had finally found the peace he had been seeking for 20 years. 47 veterans had died defending New Haven, soldiers who had survived the worst wars in human history, only to fall protecting the peaceful lives they had built from the ashes of their service. And their names were carved into a monument that would stand as long as humans called this world home. The Vraxian Dominion formally requested peace negotiations within a month, their war council having concluded that further aggression against humanity would be catastrophic for their empire. And diplomats arrived at neutral stations to begin talks that would reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. Dr. Linda Morris continued her work at the colony hospital, treating patients with the same skill and compassion she had always shown. But now her neighbors understood what she had sacrificed during her years of service and honored her with a respect that went beyond gratitude. Daniel Porter retired again, this time to a small house on Carl Henderson's farm where he tended the crops his friend had planted and watched the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded him why the fight had been worthwhile. Maria Vance received a visitor 1 year after the invasion, a young Vraxian diplomat who had been sent to study human culture and understand how such a seemingly peaceful species could harbor such devastating military capability. The diplomat asked the question that had haunted his people since their defeat: why did humanity hide its strength behind a mask of peace when they could easily dominate any species that threatened them? Maria led him to the memorial on the hill and pointed to the names carved in stone. Veterans who had given everything to protect the peaceful lives they had built. And she answered with words that the Vraxian would carry back to his people and repeat for the rest of his life: we do not hide our strength because we are ashamed of what we can do. We hide it because we understand the cost of using it better than anyone else in the galaxy. We choose peace not because we fear war, but because we have seen war and know that it destroys everything it touches. Even the victors, the Vraxian diplomat bowed his head in understanding. And when he returned to his people, he brought a new perspective that would slowly transform how his species viewed the galaxy, and their place within it. New Haven rebuilt and grew, attracting humans who wanted to live among the veterans who had proven that peace and strength were not opposites but partners. And the colony became a symbol of everything humanity had learned through centuries of conflict and healing. Daniel Porter spent his final years watching new generations grow up in the peace that he and his fellow veterans had fought to protect. And he found contentment in knowing that their sacrifice had created something lasting, something worth all the pain and loss and terrible memories. The galaxy would never again underestimate humanity. But more importantly, they would never again mistake human kindness for weakness. Because the battle-hardened veterans of New Haven had taught the universe a lesson it would never forget. The most dangerous warriors are not those who love violence, but those who have seen enough of it to choose peace, and will fight with everything they have to protect that choice. Maria Vance stood at the memorial as the sun set on another peaceful day, her hand resting on the stone where Carl Henderson's name was carved. And she smiled because she knew that somewhere beyond the stars, her old friend was finally at rest, surrounded by the peace he had spent his entire life earning through sacrifice and service, and the quiet courage of a soldier who never stopped protecting the people he loved.